You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 97. Lin Daiyu burns her poems to signal the end of her heart's folly. And Xue Baochai leaves home to take part in a solemn rite. We have seen how Daiyu, on reaching the entrance of the Naiad's house, and on hearing Nightingale's cry of relief, slumped forward, vomited blood and almost fainted. Luckily Nightingale and Ripple were both at hand to assist her into the house. When Ripple left, Nightingale and Snowgoose stood by Daiyu's bedside and watched her gradually come round. "Why are you two standing round me crying?" asked Daiyu, and Nightingale, greatly reassured to hear her talking sense again, replied. "On your way back from her old ladyship's, miss, you had quite a nasty turn. We were scared and did not know what to do. That's why we were crying." "I'm not going to die yet," said Daiyu, with a bitter smile. But before she could even finish the sentence, she was doubled up and gasping for breath once more. When she had learned earlier that day that Baoyu and Baochai were to be married, the shock of knowing that what she had feared for so long was now about to come true, had thrown her into such a turmoil that at first she had quite taken leave of her senses. Now that she had brought up the blood, her mind gradually became clearer. Though at first she could remember nothing, when she saw Nightingale crying, Simple's words slowly came back to her. This time she did not succumb to her emotions, but set her heart instead on a speedy death and final settlement of her debt with fate. Nightingale and Snowgoose could only stand by helplessly. They would have gone to inform the ladies, but were afraid of a repetition of the last occasion, when Xifeng had rebuked them for creating a false alarm. Ripple had already given all away, however, by the look of horror on her face when she returned to Grandmother Jia's apartment. The old lady, who had just risen from her midday nap, asked her what the matter was, and in her shocked state Ripple told her all that she had just witnessed. "What a terrible thing!" exclaimed Grandmother Jia aghast. She sent for Lady Wang and Xifeng at once and told them both the news. "But I gave instructions to everyone to observe strict secrecy," said Xifeng. "Who can have betrayed us? Now we have another problem on our hands." "Never mind that for the moment," said Grandmother Jia. "We must first find out how she is." She took Lady Wang and Xifeng with her to visit Daiyu, and they arrived to find her barely conscious, breathing in faint little gasps, her face bloodless and white as snow. After a while she coughed again. A maid brought the spittoon, and they watched with horror as she spat out a mouthful of blood and phlegm. Daiyu faintly opened her eyes, and seeing Grandmother Jia standing at her bedside, struggled to find breath to speak. "Grandmother, your love for me has been in vain." Grandmother Jia was most distraught. "There now, my dear, you must rest. There is nothing to fear." Daiyu smiled faintly and closed her eyes again. A maid came in to tell Xifeng that the doctor had arrived. The ladies withdrew, and Dr. Wang came in with Jiao Yen. He took Daiyu's pulses and said, "As yet, there is no cause for alarm. An obstruction of morbid humors has affected the liver, which is unable to store the blood, and as a consequence her spirit has been disturbed. I shall prescribe a medicine to check the yin, and to halt the flow of blood. I think all will be well." Dr. Wang left the room, accompanied by Jiao Yen, to write out his prescription. Grandmother Jia could tell that this time Daiyu was seriously ill, and as they left the room, she said to Lady Wang and Xifeng, "I do not wish to sound gloomy or bring her bad luck, but I fear she has small hope of recovery, poor child. You must make ready her grave clothes and coffin. Who knows, such preparations may even turn her luck. She may recover, which will be a mercy for us all. But it would be sensible anyway to be prepared for the worst, and not be taken unawares. We shall be so busy over the next few days." Xifeng said she would make the necessary arrangements. Grandmother Jia then questioned Nightingale, but she had no idea who it was that had upset Daiyu. The more she thought about it, the more it puzzled Grandmother Jia, and she said to Xifeng and Lady Wang, "I can understand that the two of them should have grown rather fond of one another, after growing up together, and playing together as children. But now that they are older and more mature, the time has come for them to observe a certain distance. She must behave properly, if she is to earn my love. It's quite wrong of her to think she can disregard such things. Then all my love will have been in vain. What you have told me troubles me. She returned to her apartment and sent for Aroma again. Aroma repeated to her all that she had told Lady Wang on the previous occasion, and in addition described the scene earlier that day between Dai and Bao Yu. And yet, when I saw her just now, said Grandmother Jia, she still seemed able to talk sense. I simply cannot understand it. Ours is a decent family. We do not tolerate unseemly goings-on. And that applies to foolish romantic attachments. If her illness is of a respectable nature, I do not mind how much we have to spend to get her better. But if she is suffering from some form of lovesickness, no amount of medicine will cure it, and she can expect no further sympathy from me either. You really shouldn't worry about Cousin Lin, Grandmother, said Shifeng. Lien will be visiting her regularly with the doctor. We must concentrate on the wedding arrangements. Early this morning I heard that the finishing touches were being put to the bridal courtyard. You and Aunt Wang and I should go over to Aunt Shui's for a final consultation. There is one thing that occurs to me, however, with Bao Chai there, it will be rather awkward for us to discuss the wedding. Maybe we should ask Aunt Shui to come over here tomorrow evening, and then we can settle everything at once. Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang agreed that her proposal was a good one and said, It is too late today. Tomorrow after lunch, let us all go over together. Grandmother Jia's dinner was now served, and Shifeng and Lady Wang returned to their apartments. Next day, Shifeng came over after breakfast. Wishing to sound out Bao Yu according to her plan, she advanced into his room and said, Congratulations, Cousin Bao. Uncle Jing has already chosen a lucky day for your wedding. Isn't that good news? Bao Yu stared at her with a blank smile, and nodded his head faintly. He is marrying you, went on Shifeng, with a studied smile, to your cousin Linear. Are you happy? Bao Yu burst out laughing. Shifeng watched him correctly, but could not make out whether he had understood her, or was simply raving. She went on. Uncle Jing says, you are to marry Miss Lin, if you get better. But not if you carry on behaving like a half-wit. Bao Yu's expression suddenly changed to one of utter seriousness, as he said. I'm not a half-wit. You're the half-wit. He stood up. I'm going to see Cousin Lin, to set her mind at rest. Shifeng quickly put out a hand to stop him. She knows already. And, as your bride-to-be, she would be much too embarrassed to receive you now. What about when we're married? Will she see me then? Shifeng found this both comic and somewhat disturbing. Aroma was right, she thought to herself. Mention Dai Yu, and while he still talks like an idiot, he at least seems to understand what's going on. I can see we shall be in real trouble, if he sees through our scheme and finds out that his bride is not to be Dai Yu after all. In reply to his question, she said, suppressing a smile. If you behave, she will see you. But not if you continue to act like an imbecile. To which Bao Yu replied. I have given my heart to Cousin Linear. If she marries me, she will bring it with her and put it back in its proper place. Now this was madman's talk if ever, thought Shifeng. She left him, and walked back into the outer room, glancing with a smile in Grandmother Jia's direction. The old lady too found Bao Yu's words both funny and distressing. I heard you both myself, she said to Shifeng. For the present, we must ignore it. Tell Aroma to do her best to calm him down. Come, let us go. Lady Wang joined them, and the three ladies went across to Aunt Shui's. On arrival there, they pretended to be concerned about the course of Xuepan's affair. Aunt Shui expressed her profound gratitude for this concern, and gave them the latest news. After they had all taken tea, Aunt Shui was about to send for Bao Chai, when Shifeng stopped her, saying, There is no need to tell Cousin Chai that we are here, Auntie. With a diplomatic smile, she continued. Grandmother's visit today is not purely a social one. She has something of importance to say, and would like you to come over later so that we can all discuss it together. Aunt Xue nodded. Of course. After a little more chat, the three ladies returned. That evening Aunt Xue came over as arranged, and after paying her respects to Grandmother Jia, went to her sister's apartment. First there was the inevitable scene of sisterly commiseration over Wang Ziding's death. Then Aunt Xue said, Just now when I was at Lady Jia's, young Bao came out to greet me, and seemed quite well. A little thin perhaps, but certainly not as ill as I had been led to expect from your description, and Shifeng's. No, it is really not that serious, said Shifeng. It's only grandmother who will worry so. Her idea is that it would be reassuring for Serging to see Bao Yu married before he leaves, as who knows when he will be able to come home from his new posting. And then from Bao Yu's own point of view, it might be just the thing to turn his luck. With Cousin Chai's golden locket to counteract the evil influence, he should make a good recovery. Aunt Xue was willing enough to go along with the idea, but was concerned that Bao Chai might feel rather hard done by. I see nothing against, she said. But I think we should all take time to think it over properly. In accordance with Shifeng's plan, Lady Wang went on. As you have no head of family present, we should like you to dispense with the usual trousseau. Tomorrow you should send Ku to let Pan know that while we proceed with the wedding, we shall continue to do our utmost to settle his court case. She made no mention of Bao Yu's feelings for Dai Yu, but continued. Since you have given your consent, the sooner they are married, the sooner things will look up for everyone. At this point, Faithful came in to take back a report to Grandmother Jia. Though Aunt Xue was still concerned about Bao Chai's feelings, she saw that in the circumstances she had no choice, and agreed to everything they had suggested. Faithful reported this to Grandmother Jia, who was delighted, and sent her back again to ask Mrs. Xue to explain to Bao Chai why it was that things were being done in this way, so that she would not feel unfairly treated. Aunt Xue agreed to do this, and it was settled that Shifeng and Jiao Lian would act as official go-betweens. Shifeng retired to her apartment, while Aunt Xue and Lady Wang stayed up talking together well into the night. Next day, Aunt Xue returned to her apartment and told Bao Chai the details of the proposal, adding, I have already given my consent. At first Bao Chai hung her head in silence. Then she began to cry. Aunt Xue said all that she could to comfort her, and went to great lengths to explain the reasoning behind the decision. Bao Chai retired to her room, and Bao Qin went in to keep her company and cheer her up. Aunt Xue also spoke to Ko, instructing him as follows. You must leave tomorrow. Find out the latest news of Pan's judgment, and then convey this message to him. Return as soon as you possibly can. Xueko was away for 4 days, at the end of which time he returned to report to Aunt Xue. The circuit judge has ratified the verdict of manslaughter, and after the next hearing his final memorial will be presented to the Provincial Supreme Court for confirmation. We should have the commutation money ready. As for Cousin Chai's affair, Cousin Pan approves entirely of your decision, Aunt. And he says that curtailing the formalities will save us a lot of money too. You are not to wait for him, but should do whatever you think best. Aunt Xue's mind was greatly eased by the knowledge that Xue Pan would soon be free to come home, and that there were now no further obstacles to the marriage. She could see that Bao Chai was unwilling to be married in this way, but reasoned with herself, even if this is not what she ideally wants, she's my daughter, and has always been obedient and well-bred. She knows I have agreed to it, and will not go against my wishes. She instructed Xueko. We must prepare the betrothal card. Take some fine gold splash paper and write on it the stems and branches of Bao Chai's birth. Then take it to Cousin Lien. Find out which day has been fixed for the exchange of presents, and make all the necessary preparations for sending ours. We shall not be inviting any friends or relatives to the wedding. Pan's friends are a worthless lot, as you yourself said, while our relations consist mainly of the Jias and the Wangs. The Jias are groom's family, and there are no Wangs in the capital at present. When Xiangyun was engaged, the Shurs did not invite us, so we need not get in touch with them. The only person I think we should invite is our business manager, Zhang Dehui. He is an older man and experienced in such things, and will be a help to us. Xueqin carried out these instructions, and sent a servant over with the betrothal card. Next day, Jiao Lian came to visit Aunt Xue. After paying his respects, he said, "I have consulted the almanac, and tomorrow is a most propitious day. I have come here today to propose that our two families exchange presents tomorrow. And please, Aunt Xue, do not be too critical about the arrangements." He presented the groom's notice, which bore the date of the wedding. Aunt Xue said a few polite words of acceptance and nodded her assent. Jiao Lian returned at once and reported to Jia Zheng. "Report to your grandmother," said Jia Zheng, "and say that as we are not inviting anybody, the wedding should be kept very simple. She can exercise her discretion over the presents. There is no need to consult me any further." Jiao Lian bowed, and went in to convey this message to grandmother Jia. Meanwhile Lady Wang had told Shifeng to bring in the presents that were being given on Bao Yu's behalf, for grandmother Jia's inspection. She also told Aroma to bring Bao Yu in to see them. He seemed highly amused by the whole business and said, "It seems such a waste of everyone's time, to send all these things from here to the garden, and then have them brought all the way back, when it's all in the family anyway." This seemed to Lady Wang and grandmother Jia sufficient proof that, whatever anyone might have said to the contrary, Bao Yu still had his wits about him, and they said as much to each other in tones of some satisfaction. Faithful and the other maids could not help but smile too. They brought the presents in and displayed them one by one, describing them as they went along. A gold necklace and other jewelry in gold and precious stones, altogether 80 pieces, 40 bolts of dragon brocade for formal wear and 120 bolts of silks and satins in various colors, 120 costumes for the 4 seasons of the year. They have not had time in the kitchen to prepare the sheep and wine, so this is money in lieu. Grandmother Jia expressed her approval, and said softly to Shifeng, "You must tell Mrs. Xue not to think of this as an empty formality. In due course, when Pan is back and she has that weight off her mind, she can have these made up into dresses for Chai. In the meantime, we shall take care of all the bed covers for the wedding day." "Yes, grandmother," replied Shifeng, and returned to her apartment. She sent Jiao Lian over first to Aunt Xue's, then summoned Zhou Rui and Bridie to receive their instructions. When delivering the presents, she said, "You are not to use the main gate. Use the little side gate in the garden that used to be kept open. I shall be going over myself shortly. The side gate has the advantage of being a long way from the Naiad's house. If anyone from any other apartment notices you, you are to tell them on no account to mention it at the Naiad's house." "Yes, ma'am." The two men departed for Aunt Xue's apartment at the head of a contingent of servants bearing the presents. Bao Yu was quite taken in by all this. His new feeling of happy anticipation had caused a general improvement in his health, though his manner of speech remained rather eccentric at times. When the present bearers returned, the whole thing was accomplished without a single name being mentioned. The family and all the staff knew, but were under orders from Shifeng to maintain absolute secrecy, and no one dared disobey. Dai meanwhile, for all the medicine she took, continued to grow iller with every day that passed. Nightingale did her utmost to raise her spirits. Our story finds her standing once more by Dai's bedside, earnestly beseeching her. "Miss, now that things have come to this pass, I simply must speak my mind. We know what it is that's eating your heart out. But can't you see that your fears are groundless? Why, look at the state Bao Yu is in. How can he possibly get married, when he's so ill? You must ignore these silly rumors, stop fretting, and let yourself get better." Dai gave a wraith-like smile, but said nothing. She started coughing again, and brought up a lot more blood. Nightingale and Snowgoose came closer, and watched her feebly struggling for breath. They knew that any further attempt to rally her would be to no avail, and could do nothing but stand there watching and weeping. Each day Nightingale went over 3 or 4 times to tell Grandmother Jia, but Faithful, judging the old lady's attitude towards Daiyu to have hardened of late, intercepted her reports and hardly mentioned Daiyu to her mistress. Grandmother Jia was preoccupied with the wedding arrangements, and in the absence of any particular news of Daiyu, did not show a great deal of interest in the girl's fate, considering it sufficient that she should be receiving medical attention. Previously, when she had been ill, Daiyu had always received frequent visits from everyone in the household, from Grandmother Jia down to the humblest maidservant. But now not a single person came to see her. The only face she saw looking down at her was that of Nightingale. She began to feel her end drawing near, and struggled to say a few words to her. Dear Nightingale. Dear sister. Closest friend. Though you were grandmother's maid before you came to serve me, over the years you have become as a sister to me. She had to stop for breath. Nightingale felt a pang of pity, was reduced to tears and could say nothing. After a long silence, Daiyu began to speak again, searching for breath between words. Dear sister. I am so uncomfortable lying down like this. Please help me up and sit next to me. I don't think you should sit up, miss, in your condition. You might get cold in the draft. Daiyu closed her eyes in silence. A little later she asked to sit up again. Nightingale and Snowgoose felt they could no longer deny her request. They propped her up on both sides with soft pillows, while Nightingale sat by her on the bed to give further support. Daiyu was not equal to the effort. The bed where she sat on it seemed to dig into her, and she struggled with all her remaining strength to lift herself up and ease the pain. She told Snowgoose to come closer. My poems. Her voice failed, and she fought for breath again. Snowgoose guessed that she meant the manuscripts she had been revising a few days previously, went to fetch them, and laid them on Daiyu's lap. Daiyu nodded, then raised her eyes and gazed in the direction of a chest that stood on a stand close by. Snowgoose did not know how to interpret this, and stood there at a loss. Daiyu stared at her now with feverish impatience. She began to cough again, and brought up another mouthful of blood. Snowgoose went to fetch some water, and Daiyu rinsed her mouth and spat into the spittoon. Nightingale wiped her lips with a handkerchief. Daiyu took the handkerchief from her and pointed to the chest. She tried to speak, but was again seized with an attack of breathlessness, and closed her eyes. Lie down, miss, said Nightingale. Daiyu shook her head. Nightingale thought she must want one of her handkerchiefs, and told Snowgoose to open the chest and bring her a plain white silk one. Daiyu looked at it, and dropped it on the bed. Making a supreme effort, she gasped out. The ones with the writing on. Nightingale finally realized that she meant the handkerchiefs Baoyu had sent her, the ones she had inscribed with her own poems. She told Snowgoose to fetch them, and herself handed them to Daiyu, with these words of advice. You must lie down and rest, Mississippi, don't start wearing yourself out. You can look at these another time, when you are feeling better. Daiyu took the handkerchiefs in one hand, and without even looking at them, brought round her other hand, which cost her a great effort, and tried with all her might to tear them in two. But she was so weak that all she could achieve was a pathetic trembling motion. Nightingale knew that Baoyu was the object of all this bitterness, but dared not mention his name, saying instead, Miss, there is no sense in working yourself up again. Daiyu nodded faintly, and slipped the handkerchiefs into her sleeve. Light the lamp, she ordered. Snowgoose promptly obeyed. Daiyu looked into the lamp, then closed her eyes and sat in silence. Another fit of breathlessness. Then, make up the fire in the brazier. Thinking she wanted it for the extra warmth, Nightingale protested. You should lie down, miss, and have another cover on. And the fumes from the brazier might be bad for you. Daiyu shook her head, and Snowgoose reluctantly made up the brazier, placing it on its stand on the floor. Daiyu made a motion with her hand, indicating that she wanted it moved up onto the Kong. Snow Goose lifted it and placed it there, temporarily using the floor stand, while she went out to fetch the special stand they used on the Kong. Dayu, far from resting back in the warmth, now inclined her body slightly forward. Nightingale had to support her with both hands as she did so. Dayu took the handkerchiefs in one hand. Staring into the flames and nodding thoughtfully to herself, she dropped them into the brazier. Nightingale was horrified, but much as she would have liked to snatch them from the flames, she did not dare move her hands and leave Dayu unsupported. Snow Goose was out of the room, fetching the brazier stand, and by now the handkerchiefs were all ablaze. "Miss," cried Nightingale. "What are you doing?" As if she had not heard, Dayu reached over for her manuscripts, glanced at them, and let them fall again onto the Kong. Nightingale, anxious lest she burn these too, leaned up against Dayu and freeing one hand, reached out with it to take hold of them. But before she could do so, Dayu had picked them up again and dropped them in the flames. The brazier was out of Nightingale's reach, and there was nothing she could do but look on helplessly. Just at that moment Snow Goose came in with the stand. She saw Dayu drop something into the fire, and without knowing what it was, rushed forward to try and save it. The manuscripts had caught at once and were already ablaze. Heedless of the danger to her hands, Snow Goose reached into the flames and pulled out what she could, throwing the paper on the floor and stamping frantically on it. But the fire had done its work, and only a few charred fragments remained. Dayu closed her eyes and slumped back, almost causing Nightingale to topple over with her. Nightingale, her heart thumping in great agitation, called Snow Goose over to help her settle Dayu down again. It was too late now to send for anyone. And yet, what if Dayu should die during the night, and the only people there were Snow Goose, herself and the one or two other junior maids in the Naiad's house? They passed a restless night. Morning came at last, and Dayu seemed a little more comfortable. But after breakfast she suddenly began coughing and vomiting, and became tense and feverish again. Nightingale could see that she had reached a crisis. She called Snow Goose and the other juniors in and told them to mount watch, while she went to report to Grandmother Jia. But when she reached Grandmother Jia's apartment, she found it almost deserted. Only a few old nannies and char ladies were there, keeping an eye. "Where is her old ladyship?" asked Nightingale. "We don't know," came the reply in chorus. That was very odd, thought Nightingale. She went into Baoyu's room and found that too quite empty, save for a single maid who answered with the same "don't know." By now Nightingale had more or less guessed the truth. How could they be so heartless and so cruel? And to think that not a soul had come to visit Dayu during the past few days. As the bitterness of it struck her with full force, she felt a great wave of resentment break out within her, and turned abruptly to go. "I shall go and find Baoyu, and see how he is faring. I wonder how he will manage to brazen it out in front of me. I remember last year, when I made up that story about Miss Lin going back to the south, he fell sick with despair. To think that now he should be openly doing a thing like this. Men must have hearts as cold as ice or snow. What hateful creatures they are." She was already at Green Delights, and found the courtyard gate ajar. All was quiet within. Suddenly she realized. Of course. If he is getting married, he will have a new apartment. But where? She was looking around her in uncertainty, when she saw Baoyu's page boy Inky rush past, and called to him to stop. He came over, and with a broad smile asked. "What are you doing here, Miss Nightingale?" "I heard that Master Bao was getting married," replied Nightingale, "and I wanted to watch some of the fun. But I can see I've come to the wrong place. And I don't know when the wedding is taking place, either." "If I tell you," said Inky in a confidential tone, "you must promise not to tell Snow Goose. We've been given orders not to let any of you know. The wedding's to be tonight. Of course it's not being held here. The master told Mr. Lien to set aside another apartment." "What's the matter?" continued Inky, after a pause. "Nothing," replied Nightingale. "You can go now." Inky rushed off again. Nightingale stood there for a while, lost in thought. Suddenly she remembered Dayu. She might already be dead. Her eyes filled with tears, and clenching her teeth, she said fiercely. Bao Yu. If she dies, you may think you can wash your hands of her in this callous way, but when you are happily married, and have your heart's desire, you needn't think you can look me in the face again. As she walked, she began to weep. She made her way, sobbing pitifully, across the garden. She was not far from the Naiad's house, when she saw two junior maids standing at the gate, peeping out nervously. They saw her coming, and one of them cried out. There's Miss Nightingale. At last. Nightingale could see that all was not well. Gesturing anxiously to them be silent, she hurried in, to find Dayu red in the face, the fire from her liver having risen upwards and inflamed her cheeks. This was a dangerous sign, and Nightingale called Dayu's old wet nurse, Nanny Wang, to come and take a look. One glance was enough to reduce this old woman to tears. Nightingale had turned to Nanny Wang as an older person, who could be expected to lend them some courage in this extremity. But she turned out to be quite helpless, and only made Nightingale more distraught than before. Suddenly she thought of someone else she could turn to, and sent one of the younger maids to fetch her with all speed. Her choice might seem a strange one, but Nightingale reasoned that as a widow, Li Wan would certainly be excluded from Bao Yu's wedding festivities. Besides, she was in general charge of affairs in the garden, and it would be in order to ask her to come. Li Wan was at home correcting some of Jia Lan's poems, when the maid came rushing frantically in and cried. Mrs. Ju. Miss Lin's dying. Everyone over there is in tears. Li Wan rose startled to her feet, and without a word set off at once for the Naiad's house, followed by her maids Candida and Casta. As she walked, she wept and lamented to herself. When I think of all the times we have spent together, oh my poor cousin. So lovely, so gifted. There is hardly another like her. Only Frost Maiden and the goddess of the moon could rival her. How can she be leaving us at such a tender age, for that distant land from whence no travelers return? And to think that because of Shifeng's deceitful scheme, I have not been able to show myself at the Naiad's house, and have done nothing to show my sisterly affection. Oh, the poor, dear girl. She was already at the gate of the Naiad's house. There was no sound from within. She began to fret. I must be too late. She must have died already, and they are resting between their lamentations. I wonder if her grave clothes and coverlet are ready? She quickened her step and hurried on into the room. A young maid standing at the inner doorway had already seen her, and called out. Mrs. Ju is here. Nightingale hurried out to meet her. How is she? Asked Li Wan. Nightingale tried to answer, but all she could muster was a choked sob. Tears poured down her cheeks like pearls from a broken necklace, as she pointed silently to where Dayu lay. Realizing with a pang what Nightingale's pitiable condition must portend, Li Wan asked no more, but went over at once to see for herself. Dayu no longer had the strength to speak. When Li Wan said her name a few times, her eyes opened a slit as if in recognition of the voice. But her eyelids and lips could only make a trembling suggestion of a movement. Although she still breathed, it was now more than she could manage to utter a single word, or shed a single tear. Li Wan turned around and saw that Nightingale was no longer in the room. She asked Snowgoose where she was, and Snowgoose replied. In the outer room. Li Wan hurried out, to find Nightingale lying on the empty bed, her face a ghastly green, her eyes closed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Where her head lay on the embroidered pillow, with its border of fine brocade, was a patch the size of a small plate, wet with her tears and the copious effusions of her nose. When Li Wan called to her, she opened her eyes slowly and raised herself slightly on the bed. Silly girl. Li Wan upbraided her. Is this a time for tears? Fetch Miss Lin's grave clothes and dress her in them. Are you going to leave it till it is too late? Would you have her go naked from the world? Would you ruin her honor? This released a fresh flood of tears on Nightingale's part. Li Wan wept herself, fretfully wiping her eyes and patting Nightingale on the shoulder. "Dear girl. Look how you are upsetting me now, and making me cry. Hurry and get her things ready. If we delay much longer, it will all be over." They were in this state of trepidation when they heard footsteps outside, and someone came running into the room in a great flurry, causing Li Wan to start back in alarm. It was Patience. When she saw their tear-stained faces, she stopped abruptly and stared at them aghast for a while. "Why aren't you over there?" asked Li Wan. "What do you want here?" As she spoke, Steward Lin's wife also came into the room. Patience answered. "Mrs. Lien was worried and sent me to see how things were. As you are here, Mrs. Ju, I can tell her to set her mind at rest." Li Wan nodded. Patience went on. "I should like to see Miss Lin myself." So saying, she walked into Dayu's bedchamber, with tears on her cheeks. Li Wan turned to Steward Lin's wife and said, "You have come just in time. Go and find your husband, and tell him to prepare Miss Lin's coffin and whatever else is necessary. When everything has been satisfactorily arranged, he is to let me know. There is no need to go over to the house." "Yes, ma'am," replied Lin's wife, but made no move to go. "Well? Is there something else?" asked Li Wan. "Mrs. Lien and her old ladyship," replied the steward's wife, "have decided that they need Miss Nightingale in attendance over there." Before Li Wan could say anything, Nightingale spoke up for herself. "Mrs. Lin, will you be so kind as to leave now? Can't you even wait until she is dead? We will leave her then, you need not fear. How can you be so?" She stopped short, thinking it inadvisable to be so rude, and changing her tone somewhat, said, "Besides, after waiting on a sick person, I fear we would not be fit for such an occasion. And while Miss Lin is still alive, she may ask for me at any time." Li Wan tried to make the peace between them. "The truth is," she said, "that this maid and Miss Lin have an affinity from a past life. Snowgoose, I know, was Miss Lin's original maid from home, but even she is not so indispensable as Nightingale. We really cannot separate them just now." Lin's wife, who had been considerably put out by Nightingale's outspoken response, was obliged to contain herself when Li Wan came to the maid's defense. Seeing Nightingale reduced to floods of tears, she eyed her with a hostile smile and said, "I shall ignore Miss Nightingale's rudeness. But am I to report what you have just said to her old ladyship? And am I to tell Mrs. Lien?" As she was speaking, Patience came out of Dayu's bedchamber, wiping her eyes. "Tell Mrs. Lien what?" she asked. Lin's wife told her the substance of their conversation. Patience lowered her head in thought. After a moment she said, "Why can't you take Snowgoose?" "Would she do?" asked Li Wan. Patience went up to her and whispered a few words in her ear. Li Wan nodded and said, "Well, in that case, it will be just as good if we send Snowgoose." "Will Miss Snowgoose do?" Lin's wife asked Patience. "Yes," replied Patience. "She will do just as well." "Then will you please tell her to come with me straight away," said Lin's wife. "I shall report to her old ladyship and Mrs. Lien. I shall say that you are both responsible for the arrangement, mind. And later you can tell Mrs. Lien yourself, Miss Patience." "Of course," replied Li Wan curtly. "Do you mean to say that someone as old and experienced as you cannot even take the responsibility for a small thing like this?" Lin's wife smiled. "It is not that I can't take the responsibility. It is just that her old ladyship and Mrs. Lien have arranged everything, and the likes of us don't really know what's going on. In the circumstances, it seems only right to mention you and Miss Patience." Patience had already told Snowgoose to come out. Over the past few days Snowgoose had fallen rather into disfavor with Dayu, who had called her a silly, ignorant child, and her feelings of loyalty towards her mistress had as a consequence been rather blunted. Besides, there was no question of her disobeying an order from her old ladyship and Mrs. Lien. She therefore tidied her hair quickly and made ready to go. Patience told her to change into her smartest clothes, and to go with Mrs. Linier. Patience herself stayed on and spoke for a short while with Li Wan. Before she left, Li Wan instructed her to call in on Lin's wife on her way, and tell her that her husband should make the necessary preparations for Daiyu with all possible speed. This Patience agreed to do and went on her way. As she turned a corner in the garden, she caught sight of Lin's wife walking ahead of her with Snowgoose, and called to her to wait. "I will take Snowgoose with me. You go and tell your husband to prepare Miss Lin's things. I will report to Mrs. Lien for you." "Yes, Miss Patience," said Lin's wife, and went on her errand. Patience then took Snowgoose to the bridal apartment, and reported there herself before going to see to her own affairs. When Snowgoose saw the wedding preparations in full swing and thought of Daiyu lying at death's door, she felt a pang of grief. But she dared not show her feelings in the presence of Grandmother Jia and Shifeng. "What can they want me for?" she wondered. "I must see what is going on. I know Baoyu used to be head over heels in love with Miss Linier. And yet now he seems to have deserted her. I begin to wonder if this illness of his is genuine or just a pretense. He may have made the whole thing up so as to avoid upsetting Miss Linier. By pretending to lose his jade and acting like an idiot, perhaps he thinks he can put her off and marry Miss Chai with a clear conscience. I must watch him closely and see if he acts the fool when he sees me. Surely he won't keep up the pretense on his wedding day?" She slipped in and stood spying at the inner doorway. Now, though Baoyu's mind was still clouded from the loss of his jade, his sense of joy at the prospect of marrying Daiyu, in his eyes the most blessed, the most wonderful thing that had happened in heaven or earth since time began, had caused a temporary resurgence of physical well-being, if not a full restoration of his mental faculties. Shifeng's ingenious plan had had exactly the intended effect, and he was now counting the minutes till he should see Daiyu. Today was the day when all his dreams were to come true, and he was filled with a feeling of ecstasy. He still occasionally let slip some telltale imbecile remark, but in other respects gave the appearance of having completely recovered. All this Snowgoose observed, and was filled with hatred for him and grief for her mistress. She knew nothing of the true cause of his joy. While Snowgoose slipped away unobserved, Baoyu told Aroma to hurry and dress him in his bridegroom's finery. He sat in Lady Wang's chamber, watching Shifeng and Yushir bustling about their preparations, himself bursting with impatience for the great moment. "If Cousin Lin is coming from the garden," he asked Aroma, "why all this fuss? Why isn't she here yet?" Suppressing a smile, Aroma replied, "She has to wait for the propitious moment." Shifeng turned to Lady Wang and said, "Because we are in mourning, we cannot have music in the street. But the traditional ceremony would seem so drab without any music at all, so I have told some of the women servants with a bit of musical knowledge, the ones who used to look after the actresses, to come and play a little, to add a bit of a festive touch." Lady Wang nodded, and said she thought this a good idea. Presently the great bridal palanquin was borne in through the main gate. The little ensemble of women servants played, as it entered down an avenue of 12 pairs of place lanterns, creating a passably stylish impression. The master of ceremonies requested the bride to step out of her palanquin, and Baoyu saw the matron of honor, all in red, lead out his bride, her face concealed by the bridal veil. There was a maid in attendance, and Baoyu saw to his surprise that it was Snowgoose. This puzzled him for a moment. Why Snowgoose, and not Nightingale, he asked himself. Then, of course, Snowgoose is Daiyu's original maid from the south, whereas Nightingale was one of our maids, which would never do. And so, when he saw Snowgoose, it was as if he had seen the face of Daiyu herself beneath the veil. The master of ceremonies chanted the liturgy, and the bride and groom knelt before heaven and earth. Grandmother Jia was called forth to receive their obeisances, as were Sir Zheng, Lady Wang and other elders of the family, after which they escorted the couple into the hall, and thence to the bridal chamber. Here they were made to sit on the bridal bed, were showered with dried fruit, and subjected to the various other practices customary in old Nanking families such as the jiaos, which we need not describe in detail here. Jia Zheng, it will be remembered, had gone along with the plan grudgingly, in deference to grandmother Jia's wishes, retaining grave though unspoken doubts himself as to her theory of turning Bao Yu's luck. But today, seeing Bao Yu bear himself with a semblance of dignity, he could not help but be pleased. The bride was now sitting alone on the bridal bed, and the moment had come for the groom to remove her veil. Shi Feng had made her preparations for this event, and now asked Grandmother Jia, Lady Wang and others of the ladies present to step forward into the bridal chamber to assist her. The sense of climax seemed to cause Bao Yu to revert somewhat to his imbecile ways, for as he approached his bride he said, "Are you better now, cuz? It's such a long time since we last saw each other. What do you want to go wrapping yourself up in that silly thing for?" He was about to raise the veil. Grandmother Jia broke into a cold sweat. But he hesitated, thinking to himself, I know how sensitive Cousin Lin is. I must be very careful not to offend her. He waited a little longer. But soon the suspense became unbearable, and he walked up to her and lifted the veil. The matron of honor took it from him, while Snow Goose melted into the background, and Oriole came forward to take her place. Bao Yu stared at his bride. Surely this was Bao Chai? Incredulous, with one hand holding the lantern, he rubbed his eyes with the other and looked again. It was Bao Chai. How pretty she looked in her wedding gown. He gazed at her soft skin, the full curve of her shoulders, and her hair done up in tresses that hung from her temples. Her eyes were moist, her lips quivered slightly. Her whole appearance had the simple elegance of a white lily, wet with pendant dew. The maidenly blush on her cheeks resembled apricot blossom wreathed in mist. For a moment he stared at her in utter astonishment. Then he noticed that Oriole was standing at her side, while Snow Goose had quite vanished. A feeling of helpless bewilderment seized him, and thinking he must be dreaming, he stood there in a motionless daze. The maids took the lamp from him and helped him to a chair, where he sat with his eyes fixed in front of him, still without uttering a single word. Grandmother Jia was anxious lest this might signal the approach of another of his fits, and herself came over to rally him, while Shi Feng and Yushi escorted Bao Chai to a chair in the inner part of the room. Bao Chai held her head bowed and said nothing. After a while, Bao Yu had composed himself sufficiently to think. He saw Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang sitting opposite him, and asked Aroma in a whisper. Where am I? This must all be a dream. A dream? Why, it's the happiest day of your life, said Aroma. How can you be so silly? Take care, Surzing is outside. Pointing now to where Bao Chai sat, and still whispering, Bao Yu asked again. Who is that beautiful lady sitting over there? Aroma found this so comical that for a while she could say nothing, but held her hand to her face to conceal her mirth. Finally she replied. That is your bride, the new Mrs. Bao Yu. The other maids also turned away, unable to contain their laughter. Bao Yu, don't be so silly. What do you mean, Mrs. Bao Yu? Who is Mrs. Bao Yu? Aroma, Miss Chai. Bao Yu, but what about Miss Lin? Aroma, the master decided you should marry Miss Chai. What's Miss Lin got to do with it? Bao Yu, but I saw her just a moment ago, and Snow Goose too. They couldn't have just vanished. What sort of trick is this that you're all playing on me? Shi Feng came up and whispered in his ear. Miss Chai is sitting over there, so please stop talking like this. If you offend her, Granny will be very cross with you. Bao Yu was now more hopelessly confused than ever. The mysterious goings-on of that night, coming on top of his already precarious mental state, had wrought him up to such a pitch of despair that all he could do was cry, I must find Cousin Lin. Again and again. Grandmother Jia and the other ladies tried to comfort him, but he was impervious to their efforts. Furthermore, with Bao Chai in the room, they had to be careful what they said. Bao Yu was clearly suffering from a severe relapse, and they now abandoned their attempts to rally him, and instead helped him to bed, while ordering several sticks of gum benzoin incense to be lit, the heavy, sedative fumes of which soon filled the room. They all stood in awesome hush. After a short while, the incense began to take effect and Bao Yu sank into a heavy slumber, much to the relief of the ladies, who sat down again to await the dawn. Grandmother Jia told Shifeng to ask Bao Chai to lie down and rest, which she did, fully dressed as she was, behaving as though she had heard nothing. Jiajing had remained in an outer room during all of this, and so had seen nothing to disillusion him of the reassuring impression he had received earlier on. The following day, as it happened, was the day selected according to the almanac for his departure to his new post. After a short rest, he took formal leave of the festivities and returned to his apartment. Grandmother Jia, too, left Bao Yu sound asleep and returned to her apartment for a brief rest. The next morning, Jiajing took leave of the ancestors in the family shrine and came to bid his mother farewell. He bowed before her and said, "I, your unworthy son, am about to depart for afar. My only wish is that you should keep warm in the cold weather and take good care of yourself. As soon as I arrive at my post, I shall write to ask how you are. You are not to worry on my account. Bao Yu's marriage has now been celebrated in accordance with your wishes, and it only remains for me to beg you to instruct him and impart to him the wisdom of your years." Grandmother Jia, for fear that Jiajing would worry on his journey, made no mention of Bao Yu's relapse but merely said, "There is one thing I should tell you. Although the rites were performed last night, Bao Yu's marriage was not properly consummated. His health would not allow it. Custom, I know, decrees that he should see you off today. But in view of all the circumstances, his earlier illness, the luck turning, his still fragile state of convalescence, and yesterday's exertions, I am worried that by going out he might catch a chill. So I put it to you, if you wish him to fulfill his filial obligations by seeing you off, then send for him at once and instruct him accordingly, but if you love him, then spare him, and let him say goodbye and make his kowtow to you here." "Why should I want him to see me off?" returned Jiajing. "All I want is that from now on he should study in earnest. That would bring me greater pleasure by far." Grandmother Jia was most relieved to hear this. She told Jiajing to be seated and sent Faithful, after imparting to her various secret instructions, to fetch Bao Yu and to bring Aroma with him. Faithful had not been away many minutes when Bao Yu came in and with the usual promptings, performed his duty to his father. Luckily the sight of his father brought him, for a few moments, sufficient clarity to get through the formalities without any gross lapses. Jiajing delivered himself of a few exhortatory words, to all of which his son gave the correct replies. Then Jiajing told Aroma to escort him back to his room, while he himself went to Lady Wang's apartment. There he earnestly enjoined Lady Wang to take charge of Bao Yu's moral welfare during his absence. There must be none of his previous unruliness, he added. He must now prepare himself to enter for next year's provincial examination. Lady Wang assured him that she would do her utmost, and without mentioning anything else, at once sent a maid to escort Bao Chai into the room. Bao Chai performed the rite proper to a newly married bride seeing off her father-in-law, and then remained in the room when Jiajing left. The other women folk accompanied him as far as the inner gate before turning back. Cousin Jin and the other young male Jiaos received a few words of exhortation, drank a farewell toast, and, together with a crowd of other friends and relatives, accompanied him as far as the hostelry of the tearful parting, some 3 or 4 miles beyond the city walls, where they bid their final farewell. But of Jiajing's departure no more. Let us return to Bao Yu, who on leaving his father, had suffered an immediate relapse. His mind became more and more clouded, and he could swallow neither food nor drink. Whether or not he was to emerge from this crisis alive will be revealed in the next chapter.